Emily Sanders, the model student who always followed the rules, vanished without a trace one cold autumn evening. As her family and friends frantically searched for answers, they never imagined that the key to unraveling her disappearance would lie in a series of private messages between her and Mr. Daniel Harris, the charismatic history teacher everyone trusted. What seemed like a harmless mentor-student relationship would soon reveal a dark, dangerous secret, one that would shake their small town to its core. Emily Sanders was the kind of student who everyone noticed, but no one truly knew. She had the perfect reputation: polite, intelligent, and hard-working. At 17, she was already considered one of the brightest stars at Westbrook Academy, a prestigious private school where the pressure to excel was high and the competition fierce. She had the grades to prove it, consistently topping her class in subjects ranging from advanced calculus to literature. Her teachers often praised her work ethic, and her peers admired her quiet confidence. Emily was the kind of student that parents dreamed of for their children, a role model who was sure to go places. Her social life, though not overly flashy, was just as well managed. She had a small but tight-knit group of friends. They spent their weekends studying together, volunteering at local charities or attending school events. Emily was always there, offering support when needed and blending seamlessly into the group. There were no wild nights out, no shocking behaviors that could disrupt the image of perfection that she carefully curated. But even the most perfect masks hide something beneath. And for Emily, that mask concealed a secret life that no one suspected. She had managed to keep it hidden from her closest friends, her family, and even her teachers. No one had a clue that she was carrying a burden that was becoming too heavy to bear. At school, Emily's interactions with the staff were nothing short of respectful. She got along well with every teacher, especially Mr. Daniel Harris, her history teacher. He was in his early 40s, tall and charismatic, with a reputation for being one of the most popular teachers at Westbrook. He had a way of making history come alive in a way that engaged his students. Emily was one of his top students, frequently praised for her insightful essays and her ability to grasp complex concepts with ease. Mr. Harris took a particular interest in her work, often staying after class to discuss topics in greater detail, something he rarely did with other students. What started as academic mentorship, however, slowly transformed into something much more personal. Emily began confiding in him more and more. She spoke about the pressure she felt at school, the expectations her parents had for her future, and the loneliness she sometimes felt despite being surrounded by people. Mr. Harris listened patiently, offering words of encouragement and understanding. His supportive nature made him a trusted figure in Emily's life, someone she could turn to when the weight of the world seemed too much to carry. Over time, these conversations grew more frequent and more intimate. Emily began to notice that their exchanges weren't just about school or her future. There were subtle compliments, lingering glances, and moments of closeness that made her feel uneasy, but she pushed the discomfort aside. Mr. Harris was simply a compassionate teacher who genuinely cared about her well-being, she told herself. Still, as the weeks went by, the line between professional and personal began to blur, and what had started as a harmless connection evolved into something Emily couldn't quite define. It wasn't until a late-night message on her phone that Emily truly understood the nature of what was happening between them. The message, innocuous at first, hinted at something more. A touch of flirtation that left Emily confused and, for the first time, unsettled. She wanted to deny it, to believe that she was reading too much into it. But deep down, she knew something was shifting in her relationship with Mr. Harris. And that was when the first seeds of doubt began to take root in her mind. Despite the nagging feeling, Emily continued to hide the growing connection, keeping it locked away from the eyes of her friends and family. She didn't know how to explain what was happening or what to do about it. Her perfect life was beginning to feel like a facade, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up the act. But she never imagined just how quickly that secret would unravel, changing everything she thought she knew about herself and the world around her. It started like any other day. Emily had attended her classes, sat through lectures, and spent her lunch break in the library, as she often did. She had recently started feeling a sense of unease, though, a nagging thought that something wasn't right, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. She had been trying to ignore it, convincing herself it was just the stress of finals and the pressure to perform. But that afternoon was different. By the time the school bell rang, signaling the end of the day, Emily hadn't returned home. Her parents had grown used to her staying late at school for extra study sessions, but they had expected her to arrive by dinner, like she always did. When she didn't, they grew worried. At first, they assumed she had stayed after school to meet a friend or work on a project. But as hours passed and there was still no sign of her, concern turned into panic. Emily's mother, Lorraine, called the school, but the staff hadn't seen her leave. Her father, Robert, made calls to her close friends, but no one had heard from her either. It wasn't like Emily to go off without informing anyone. She wasn't the type to cause trouble, and she certainly wasn't the type to run away. By the time the police were called, the situation had escalated. A search was quickly launched, but it yielded no results. The entire town of Westbrook was on edge. Emily had no history of problems at home or school, and there was no indication that she had any reason to disappear. She wasn't the kind of student who skipped school or got involved in any risky behavior. Her teachers, including Mr. Harris, were shocked by the news. But as the search for Emily continued, some things just didn't add up. Despite being a model student with a bright future ahead of her, Emily had left behind almost no clues. There was no sign of her belongings missing. From her room, no indication that she had packed a bag or made preparations for a disappearance. She hadn't sent any messages, left any notes, or reached out to anyone in any way. The more investigators dug into her life, the more questions arose. Why had Emily vanished without a trace? What had happened to her? Then a breakthrough came in an unexpected form. Sarah, one of Emily's closest friends, had spent the night combing through the social media accounts of her missing friend. They had often shared memes and private messages, so Sarah knew Emily's online patterns well. As she sifted through Emily's messages on her phone, something caught her attention, an exchange with none other than Mr. Harris. At first, the messages seemed harmless, typical for two people who shared a teacher-student bond. They discussed schoolwork, future aspirations, and summer plans. But as Sarah read further, the tone of the messages shifted. The exchange became more personal, with Mr. Harris asking Emily about her emotional state, offering words of encouragement that bordered on the overly familiar. Then the messages started to become flirtatious, even suggestive. Emily had always spoken highly of Mr. Harris, calling him the best teacher she'd ever had, but Sarah had no idea that their interactions had extended beyond the classroom. Now, reading through these private messages, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The words, subtle yet unmistakable, hinted at something more. It wasn't just mentorship anymore. It was something darker, something that felt off, like a secret that shouldn't have been kept. With shaking hands, Sarah knew she had to do something. She immediately called the police and shared the troubling discovery. Authorities were quick to act, pulling up more of the conversation history between Emily and Mr. Harris. The pattern was undeniable. The messages grew increasingly intimate, culminating in exchanges that were not just inappropriate, but predatory in nature. Emily had confided in Mr. Harris in ways that left her vulnerable, and now those vulnerabilities seemed to have been exploited. The police wasted no time in speaking with Mr. Harris, but when they confronted him with the messages, he maintained his calm, insisting that the relationship between him and Emily had always been strictly professional. He downplayed the flirtations as nothing more than friendly banter and dismissed the nature of their personal conversations as nothing out of the ordinary. However, the messages told a very different story, one that was growing darker by the minute. Emily's disappearance was no longer just a missing persons case. It was now a case involving manipulation, deceit, and the possible abuse of power. The question on everyone's mind was no longer, where is Emily, but what happened between Emily and Mr. Harris. The discovery of the messages sent shockwaves through the investigation. Emily's disappearance had gone from being a puzzling mystery to a chilling case of potential exploitation. As authorities examined the full scope of the private conversations between Emily and Mr. Harris, they found disturbing patterns. What had initially appeared to be innocent, professional exchanges now felt far more sinister. The messages revealed a series of intimate moments shared between Emily and Mr. Harris, each more personal than the last. Their conversations were laced with subtle compliments, suggestions, and words that straddled the line between teacherly advice and something more inappropriate. Mr. Harris often expressed admiration for Emily's intelligence and maturity, but as the months wore on, the messages grew more suggestive. They became less about school and more about her personal life, often asking about her feelings, her thoughts on relationships, and her worries, questions that a teacher shouldn't be asking a student. What was most unsettling was the way Mr. Harris's tone shifted as Emily's responses became more hesitant. It was clear that the young woman, while continuing to engage with him, was starting to feel uncomfortable. She would sometimes write short, reserved answers or change the subject, but each time she pulled away, Mr. Harris would respond with even more reassurance and persistence, drawing her back into a conversation that felt increasingly like an emotional trap. The final message, sent just hours before Emily vanished, was the most troubling of all. It was a single line. "I'm looking forward to seeing you tonight. We have a lot to discuss." There was no context to this message. Emily hadn't mentioned meeting him anywhere, and the urgency in Mr. Harris's words made it clear that this wasn't an innocent meeting. The investigators were now certain that something had happened between them, something far more complicated than anyone had imagined. Sarah, Emily's friend, was horrified by the messages she had uncovered. She had been with Emily the night before her disappearance, and there hadn't been any signs of distress. Emily had seemed normal, her usual calm self, even chatting about a project they were working on. Sarah couldn't understand how things had spiraled so quickly. She recalled Emily always praising Mr. Harris, calling him the teacher who really understood her, but she never thought it would go this far. In a state of disbelief, Sarah spoke to the authorities again, recounting everything she knew. But she also had her own questions. Could Emily have been coerced into meeting Mr. Harris? Or had she voluntarily gone to see him? Was she scared of him? Sarah didn't have answers, only more questions that seemed to deepen the mystery. The police were now faced with two possible scenarios. Emily had either been lured into something she hadn't wanted, or she had left on her own, terrified of what would happen if the truth about her relationship with Mr. Harris came to light. Either way, the situation was becoming far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The investigation turned its focus squarely on Mr. Harris. When they questioned him about his relationship with Emily, he was coolly evasive, claiming that their interactions were just those of a concerned teacher offering guidance. But the more they delved into his past, the more concerning details emerged. They discovered that Emily wasn't the first student to have an unusually close relationship with Mr. Harris. There were whispers among former students who had felt uncomfortable with the way he crossed professional boundaries, though no one had ever formally reported anything. As the authorities gathered evidence, they found more texts and emails, some dating back several years, that suggested a pattern. Mr. Harris had used his position to get close to vulnerable students, providing them with a false sense of security, only to manipulate them emotionally. But until now, no one had realized how far he had gone. how his behavior had escalated. By the time the investigation was in full swing, Emily's disappearance no longer seemed like a random act or an impulsive escape. It was clear that she had been drawn into something far darker. Her absence was no longer a simple missing person case. It was a deeply personal and calculated act, one that could have been carefully orchestrated by someone who had more control over her life than anyone had realized. The police couldn't ignore the possibility that Emily had run away to escape Mr. Harris's influence. But if that was the case, where had she gone? And why hadn't she reached out to anyone? The walls of secrecy had started closing in, and the search for Emily had just begun to uncover more than anyone had anticipated. As the investigation into Mr. Harris deepened, unsettling truths began to emerge about his past. Police had already been shocked by the nature of his relationship with Emily, but it was soon revealed that he wasn't a stranger to crossing professional boundaries. The more they dug, the clearer it became that Mr. Harris had a history of inappropriate behavior that had been carefully concealed, hidden under the guise of being a dedicated, compassionate teacher. Detectives found evidence of several previous interactions that raised red flags, all documented in emails and messages between Mr. Harris and other students from past years. He had been careful, even manipulative, in his communication. At first, his messages were subtle: compliments on their intelligence, offers of extra tutoring, and attention to personal details that made the students feel special. But over time, the exchanges shifted, becoming more personal, more intimate. 1. Former student Hannah, who had graduated 2 years earlier, came forward. She revealed that Mr. Harris had been her mentor, someone she turned to when struggling with her grades and dealing with personal issues at home. Like Emily, she had trusted him, admired him, and allowed him to become a sounding board for her life's challenges. However, as the conversations grew more personal, she started feeling uncomfortable with the attention he gave her. He began texting her late at night, asking for details about her romantic life, offering advice that crossed the line into something more. When she began to pull away, his messages became more insistent, more demanding of her attention. Hannah had eventually distanced herself from him, but she had never reported the behavior. She felt embarrassed, ashamed, and, like many other students, unsure of how to confront a respected teacher. She was just one of several students who had felt a growing unease about his attentions, but none had been bold enough to speak up. No one had connected the dots until Emily's case brought it all into the light. As the investigation continued, more former students came forward, and it became apparent that Mr. Harris had preyed on vulnerable individuals, offering them attention and validation they might not have received elsewhere. He used his position to get closer to those who seemed isolated or who struggled academically, and for those who didn't question his intentions, he became a mentor, someone to turn to during tough times. But for those who did feel something was wrong, the bond had already been established. They felt trapped by his emotional manipulation, afraid to speak out for fear of losing the attention they had been given. Despite the mounting evidence, Mr. Harris maintained his innocence, claiming that the messages were simply a way of reaching out to students who needed guidance. He insisted that he was only ever acting in the best interest of his students. When questioned by the police, his calm demeanor was chilling. He didn't seem rattled or concerned, and his answers were practiced, rehearsed. His refusal to acknowledge any wrongdoing only made investigators more suspicious. It was as though he had become so accustomed to hiding his actions behind a facade of professionalism that he could no longer recognize where the line had been crossed. But there was something else, something even more disturbing, that had begun to come to light. The police discovered that in the weeks leading up to Emily's disappearance, Mr. Harris had been particularly focused on her. He had sent her messages late into the night, messages that had become increasingly demanding. Some of his texts were filled with a sense of urgency, as though Emily's responses were the only thing keeping him grounded. In a few, he even hinted at meeting in person to discuss things, though the details were vague. It was clear now that Emily had been caught in a web of manipulation. The authorities realized they were dealing with more than just a teacher-student affair. They were facing a man who had carefully, methodically built a network of influence, using his power as a teacher to isolate and control his students. But the most chilling realization of all was that Emily, in her fear, had tried to pull away, only to have Mr. Harris draw her back in with threats and emotional blackmail. This wasn't just about an inappropriate relationship, it was about control, power, and manipulation. When Mr. Harris's past was finally exposed, the full scale of his predatory behavior became clear. The investigation began to focus on his movements in the days leading up to Emily's disappearance. The question no longer was whether he was involved in her vanishing, but how far he would go to keep his secret safe. Had Emily run away out of fear? Or had something darker happened to her? Something that had been set in motion long before she went missing? The police had to find out, but every lead seemed to spiral deeper into a tangled web of deception, She was sitting in a secluded spot near a small park, her face pale and her eyes red, as if she had been crying for days. Her clothes were disheveled, and she looked thin, almost fragile. When the police approached, Emily didn't speak at first, too overwhelmed by the emotions surging through her. It wasn't until they gently coaxed her that she finally began to speak, her words coming in broken sentences. At first, she didn't seem to want to tell them the truth. She hesitated, clearly torn between fear and the overwhelming urge to confess. She admitted that she had run away, but the deeper she spoke, the more her story unraveled. Emily revealed that she had been hiding out for days, terrified of what might happen if she returned home or faced the truth. She explained how she had feared the consequences of what would happen if anyone found out about her relationship with Mr. Harris, the secret that had now come to light in the most public of ways. Her voice cracked as she recounted the emotional manipulation she had endured. Emily had tried to resist, but Mr. Harris had a way of drawing her back in, making her feel like she was the one responsible for their connection. The fear of being exposed, of ruining her future, had driven her to run. The final straw had come, just before she disappeared, an ultimatum. Mr. Harris had threatened to tell everyone about their relationship unless she agreed to meet him one last time. It was then that Emily had made the decision to escape, to cut all ties, even if it meant losing everything else. In the following days, Emily's testimony painted a clear picture of the emotional hold Mr. Harris had over her. She hadn't gone to the police because she didn't know how to explain what had happened. She didn't know how to confess without being judged, without feeling like she had somehow failed. Emily feared not just the consequences from her family, but also the shame of being caught in a situation that felt so wrong, yet so difficult to break free from. Her disappearance, it seemed, wasn't a result of her running away in defiance, but out of sheer desperation. She had been trapped in a web of guilt and fear, and running was her only way out. It was clear now that Mr. Harris had used his authority and the trust Emily placed in him to manipulate and control her, driving her to make choices she would never have made on her own. The police, now armed with this knowledge, moved quickly to arrest Mr. Harris. He was apprehended at his home, where he denied everything once again. His cold and methodical demeanor remained unchanged, even when faced with the damning evidence, the messages, the testimonies, the pattern of manipulation that spanned years. He tried to justify his actions, insisting that he had always acted out of a desire to help his students. But his words felt hollow, meaningless in the face of Emily's bravery in speaking out. Mr. Harris was charged with multiple counts of misconduct, emotional abuse, and manipulation. The school, already rocked by the scandal, was forced to reckon with the damage done. There was a growing sense of betrayal among students and parents, some of whom had entrusted their children to a man who had abused his power for years. As for Emily, the road to healing would be long. The weight of what had happened would follow her for years to come, but she found solace in the truth finally coming to light. She wasn't just a victim, she was a survivor, and she had found the courage to speak out. The community, though forever scarred by the events, began to slowly rebuild. The conversation surrounding power, trust, and manipulation would never be the same again. Emily's story, while tragic, sparked a wider conversation about the importance of boundaries, of speaking out, and of giving people, especially young people, the tools to recognize when something is wrong. Though her life would never be the same, she hoped her ordeal would help others find their own strength before it was too late. In the end, the truth had set her free.